He moves into it.
You're listening to A View from the Hill.
There it goes. It's high enough. It's long enough.
The Rugby League Supporters Program.
The beauty.
Hello and welcome to That's the Way It Was, a program that looks back at the history of rugby league. In episode 9, the 1980s was the most successful decade in the history of the Canterbury-Bankstown Rugby League Club. They won premierships in 1980, 1984, 1985 and 1988. But amongst all this success, one team stood out, a team that would create a legacy that lasts to the present day. To discuss this period of Canterbury's history, we're going to speak to Steve Griege, a former panellist on Radio 2SER's A View from the Hill, reporter for Rugby League Review and a lifelong Canterbury supporter. So, Steve, welcome to That's the Way It Was.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here. Nice to talk to you again.
Now, Steve, before we have a look at this very successful period, I think we should look at the lead-up to 1984, the so-called Glossop years, when after, of course, Canterbury coach at the time, Ted Glossop. Just briefly tell us about Canterbury during the Glossop years.
Yeah, well, he came over to the Bulldogs from the Sharks. His first year was in 78. They made the finals, so they got knocked out by Para. 79, they made a great run from fifth spot, and they almost beat the Dragons. They came home in the second half, but they just gave them too much of a head start in the first half, so they lost that grand final 17-13. But 80 was the year most people remember with Glossop. That was the year they beat the Roosters, 18-4 in the grand final, and everyone remembers that try by Steve Gearin where Brendel makes the break, puts the big bomb up, and he catches it, races down and catches it. It's probably one of the greatest tries in the history of rugby league grand finals, and it probably epitomises the way the Bulldogs played under Glossop. They were the entertainers. They played with a lot of flair and freedom. That's the type of coach he was. But unfortunately, after the 1980, they had a bit of had a lot of injuries. An outbreak of glandular fever decimated the side in 81. So they finished pretty close to the wooden spoon. I think it was about 10th.
Yes.
They finished in 81. And then 82 was a bit better year. But unfortunately, they lost their last three games. And so they missed out on the finals again in 82. So the writing was on the wall. And if you read the newspapers, that Glossop was in a bit of trouble to keep his job in 83. And they didn't get off to a great start, but they did come home pretty good. And they did make the preliminary final. They got beaten by the eventual premiers, Parramatta, 18-4 in that prelim final. But really, I know one of my eyes is blue, one eye is white. I'm a Bulldog man, but really, around that time, Parramatta and Manly, they were the benchmark teams. Like in '83, Manly beat the Bulldogs twice by over 30 points, and Parramatta, they were too good for them in both times they played them in the semi-finals.
All right,
they blew them off the park in the first half. So they. I think deep down they knew they had to change their ways from being the entertainers, and that's why they brought Warren Ryan in, and he beefed up the forward pack. They big off season spending spree, and of course in the lead up to '84 they got Terry Lamb back home, who was originally a Bulldogs junior, but he started his career with Western Suburbs because he was behind Gary Hughes at the time, so he thought he'd get more game time with the Magpies, and he even won the Dally M. In 1983. Yeah.
All right. No. So it is 1984. It's Canterbury's 50th year in the competition, of course, because they entered the New South Wales Rugby League in 1935. Ted Glossop leaves the club, and the Canterbury secretary, Peter Moore, brings in a fellow who he knew from his days at Belmore High School. Warren Ryan becomes the coach of Canterbury. What can you tell us about Warren Ryan?
Well, Warren Ryan, he actually played for the Dragons back in the mid '60s, and he got one game, I think. So, and then he played for the Sharks for a few years. But he pretty much made his name, Warren Ryan, for when he took over the Newtown Jets and got them all the way to the grand final in '81. Before he'd come to the Jets, they were sort of pretty much wooden spoon material sort of thing. But he rebuilt the side, and they were pretty unlucky not to win that one in '81 because they were ahead there at some stage, and that's where he made his name for him. And then and then he was, but everyone remember him pretty much for his success at the Bulldogs that came after that in 84 and 85 when he got back-to-back titles.
But he brought a new he brought a new sort of style and new methods to Canterbury as a team, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, most people in the late 70s, early 80s, they all loved the Bulldogs because they were the entertainers. They had
Yes.
the Hughes and the Mortimer brothers, and it was razzle dazzle. But Ryan wasn't like that. He didn't really like the flair and all that sort of stuff. He was a bit more no frills, very focused on defence. That bruising, intimidating, gang tackling. He also brought in the umbrella defence sort of thing. So if you look at their stats from 84 to 83, sure, their attack was down quite a bit, but their defence had improved by 100%. I think they only, in their last 6 games of the season in 84, they only leaked 20 points, and that was including the finals games. So,
all right.
He definitely focused on defence.
All right, okay, so before the season starts, Canterbury go on a bit of a massive spending spree, really. They buy Peter Tunks from South, Brian Batiste comes from Western Suburbs, Daryl Broman comes from Penrith, and Warren Ryan brings across 2 of the players he knew from Newtown, Peter Kelly and Mark Bugden. And the most sought-after player in the off-season is the Western Suburbs 5'8", Terry Lamb. And Terry Lamb joins Canterbury, and this proves to be a crucial signing, Steve, because tell us a bit about Terry Lamb and his impact at the Canterbury club.
Yeah, well, some people consider Terry Lamb, the signing of Terry Lamb, even though he was originally a Bulldogs junior, he was a Chester Hill boy, just like Jeff Robinson, but some say he was the most important signing in Canterbury's history because, he made a huge difference when he came to the Bulldogs. Sure, Mortimer and Hughes had a great combination, but Lamb took it to the next level, and I think he took a little bit of pressure off Turvey. Just with, Lamb, he was a great support player, always backing up. That's how he scored the majority of his tries. He scored 17 tries in that season, and he was, I know Warren Ryan definitely thinks he was the difference, why the Bulldogs went to that next level from, falling 1 game short in 83 and then in 84 going 1 better. But yeah, he was the ultimate support player.
That was it. That was it.
He got the Dally M 5'8" of the year that year, and also won the Rothmans medal too.
Yes, he was Dally M. He was playing, the year he played for West there, obviously 1983 was the Dally M Player of the Year, and Western Suburbs finished last that year. So to win the award for a team when you're playing for a team that finishes last is a pretty big achievement. But you said there that he was a great support player. This is my memory of Terry Lamb, that just when the movement looked like it was going to break down, he was there, and he would either go on and score the try or keep the movement going. He was a great a support player. He never gave up on the play.
Yeah, exactly. That's how he always, you're always backing up on the inside sort of thing, and that's how he scored. Over his whole career with the Bulldogs, I think he ended up with 123 tries, and a lot of them would have been, whether he was backing up the forwards, a little offload, and he'd race through. He was quite nippy for, he was only a little bloke. He's only about 166 centimetres, but he was quite good on his feet. But yeah, he was a, some would say that the best Bulldog player ever. I don't know. I'm a little bit biased. I'm still on the Steve Mortimer bandwagon, but yeah.
And he retired. After Canterbury won the 1995 grand final, he retired. But then, of course, he came back. He retired and came back because Canterbury did lose a lot of players during that Super League war period there. But he retired and came back, and he ended up. It was a bit of a controversial moment for him, but he did end up being credited with being the first player to play 350 first grade games.
Yeah, well, he had they weren't all with the Bulldogs. He did. It was 262 with the Bulldogs. The rest were with West between I think 80 and 83 sort of thing. But but yeah, he had a great career, and a little bloke like that, only 166 centimetres and 80 kilos, to play that many games, like. You don't see guys like that anymore playing like that size of player. Unfortunately, with the way the game is now, those little guys like him and Turvey, they would have been, bashed out of the game, or they wouldn't have got a start by all the junior rep coaches and all that, because they all, the bigger body sort of thing. But then they don't have the magic of these players from that era.
Okay, so the 1984 season starts, and Canterbury have got a very tough draw. They have to play a lot of the premiership fancies, so to speak, a lot of the premiership fancies in the early rounds. Round one, but they come up against Parramatta and they win. They defeat Parramatta by 18-16. They beat East in the second round. Eastern Suburbs at this stage are sort of like considered a premiership chance. They go on also to have victories against Manly and Balmain. Their only loss really in that first period of 1984 was to St George. They get beaten by St George in round 3. But after 6 rounds of the premiership, Canterbury are on top of the table and they remain there for the rest of the season. But a very impressive start, as I said. They had a difficult draw, and Steve, no better way to start the season, of course, than to defeat the defending premiers in round 1. They defeated Parramatta by 18 points to 16.
Yeah, I remember that game very well. I was actually at the game. Mum took me there. Like, I grew up in the inner city, but we'd hop on the train and head out to Belmore. That was a great day, because the Bulldogs were actually behind with not long to go. And I remember Phil Gould hoisting a big bomb up, and the Eels fumbled it. I think it might have been Paul Taylor, possibly. And Terry Lamb, of course, was on the spot and spread it wide. And Kevin Pobji, who they bought in the off-season from Penrith, scored to lock things up. And then Terry Lamb, he'd already earned his money. He had a great game in his first match. But he then converted from the sideline where with the big grandstand in the background, and that's to get us home by 2. And it was a great start to the season, because especially a lot of our listeners might not recall, but in those days, Parramatta and the Bulldogs both shared Belmore Sports Ground for quite a few years, while the new Parramatta Stadium was getting rebuilt after it got burnt down after they won the 81 title. So it made it even sweeter to beat them on our home turf.
All right, now, throughout the rest of the season, there are a number of other important games, matches for Canterbury throughout this season. One of those ones that I'd like to highlight, there was a round 14 match against Parramatta. Now, what happened in this match? This is round 14 now. The second round match against Parramatta. What happened in the second round match against Parramatta?
Well, it was another close encounter, but this time Parra got the win in slightly controversial circumstances. But the Bulldogs ended up being 14-13. There was a big crowd there, about 23,000 there on the day. Lamb once again had a great game. Baba, he scored a double. I remember the first try. Mick Potter, who ended up getting, I think I might have mentioned earlier, got Dally M Player of the Year in '84. He was on his way up, and he made a big break, and then he put a kick through, and Terry Lamb won the race to the ball, and I think that was in the first half. And then in the second half, they scored another great. Well, this was more of a team try. They spread it wide down the left, and then Ross Conlon on the wing back inside. Peter Tunks of all people, big Peter Tunks from South, the big front rower, was backing up, and he popped it back, and who was on his inside, of course, trailing through the middle. Terry Lamb to score another one. So I thought they were home then, but unfortunately got a bit of a dud call. But so unfortunately they didn't get the points that day. But they got revenge in the semis and in the grand final.
Well, it was
a little bit later in the season. Yeah,
well, it was a controversial game because the winning try, Neville Hunt scores the winning try for Parramatta, and replays show that the try was scored on the 7th tackle, and Canterbury were considering protesting and so forth to the New South Wales Rugby League, but it was the start of a bit of a feud that Canterbury had during this period with referee Kevin Roberts. It would continue on for a few seasons to start, but this is sort of like where it basically started in that round 14 match in 1984. The other match that I wanted to talk about was the round 22 match against Cronulla at Belmore. Now, Cronulla are not having a very good season at all. In fact, but Cronulla actually defeated Canterbury twice during this season. It was a very big loss, but Warren Ryan reacted quite strongly after this game.
Yeah, well, a lot of people remember this game also too, because it was actually the first game that Steve Mortimer finally got to captain the Bulldogs.
Yeah.
A lot of people might not realise, but he wasn't actually the captain at the start of the season. It was actually Chris Anderson for a long time, but then he got injured.
Yep.
And then folks captained one game, but Warren Ryan wanted Terry Lamb to captain the team. But Barbar, being a team player and seeing how inspirational a skipper Turvey was during the State of Origin that season, he fell on his sword and went up to Warren Ryan and said, "No, I think Turvey should put, especially too, Barbar was a bit uncomfortable because it was his first season with the Bulldogs and Turvey had been there a long time sort of thing." So he didn't get off to the greatest start, of his captaining the Bulldogs. They did get a touch-up at home at Belmore, 24-6. I think Tunks was the only one who scored that day, but it did prove to be a turning point because after that game, they went on a run. They tinkered with the team, as you said, made a few changes, and then they went on a run and they won their last 6 games. I think they scored about 133 points and they only let in 20 points in those next few games, and that was including playing, Parramatta twice in the finals.
All right, well, I just want to talk about that final series because Canterbury finish on top of the table. It's their 4th minor premiership. They defeat Parramatta in the major semi-final there by 16-8. Parramatta then really got out of jail. In the preliminary final in 1984, they played St George, and Parramatta, they score a try in the last minute there. Eric Groth scored in the last minute. They defeat St George by 8-7. So the 1984 grand final is between Canterbury will play Parramatta in the 1984 grand final. Now, Steve, just before we talk about this match, I'll just go quickly through these two teams. For Parramatta, remember Parramatta are going for their 4th premiership in a row. The fullback was Paul Taylor. The wingers were Neil Hunt and Eric Groth. Centres were Mick Cronin and Steve Ella. The halves were Kenny and Sterling. Ray Price was the lock forward. The second row was John Muggleton and Chris Phelan. The front rowers were Paul Mayers and Stan Jerd. And the hooker and captain was Stephen Edge. On the bench they had Steve Sharp, David Lydiard, Glenn Mansfield and Ron Quinn. For Canterbury, Michael Potter was the fullback. The wingers were Peter Mortimer and Steve O'Brien. Centres were Andrew Farrow and Chris Mortimer. The halves were Lamb and Steve Mortimer. Steve Mortimer also was the captain. Paul Langmack at lock. Second rowers were Steve Folkes and Brian Batiste. Kelly and Tunks in the front row. Mark Bugden was the hooker. On the bench was Greg Mullane, Jeff Robertson and Darryl Broman. So for Canterbury, the only survivors from the 1980 team were the Mortimer brothers and Steve Folkes and Jeff Robertson, of course, who was on the bench. Now, Steve, most people would look at this scoreline and they'd probably think that nothing much happened in this grand final, but in actual fact, there were a lot of major incidents in the 1984 grand final. Just take us through what happened in this match. Yeah,
well, as you said, Rob, people these days they say, 6-4, gee, it must have been a pretty, scrappy game, and but it definitely was, a gripping grand final. It did go down to the wire. Probably the first thing that I remember, that Paris suffered a bit of an early blow. Steve Ella, the zip man, he went off. So that was a big, they had to do a reshuffle. Sure, they had Lydiard to come in, and he played okay, but he wasn't at the same level as Steve Ella. Didn't have the experience or the speed and all that. So that was a bit of a little that helped the Bulldogs' cause. But the Bulldogs were robbed in the first half, I believe. I think Peter Mortimer, his try, like the pass from Terry Lamb, I've seen a lot worse, let go sort of thing. And also, too, it might have looked like it was floating forward, but it came out of the back of his hands, like his hands were pointing backwards sort of thing. So I think it was a fair try. And as you mentioned earlier about because Kevin Roberts was the ref, that was a sore point with the Bulldogs that sort of fanned the flames into 85 and all that. They were dirty on that one for a long time, because that could have made the game a little bit different. Sort of the Bulldogs definitely would have been leading at half time with that try. And then the only try of the first half, actually, like Groth probably should have scored. Parra had a great set play from the scrum, and he had the line wide open, but he spilt the ball with no one in front of him. But they did get on the board just before half time. Andrew Farah from the Bulldogs had made a mistake pretty close to the Bulldogs try line just before half time. And then Sterlo threw a great short ball to Cronin, and he crashed over just before half time. Unfortunately, he couldn't convert, so it was 4-0 to the Eels at half time.
Yes. Then in the second half, I mean, as you said there, it was a very gripping game. The defensive intensity there was high. There was some incredible defensive performances. Incredible saves were made during tries seemed certain, but someone would come out and make the miraculous tackle. But in the end, the winning try, really came from nothing.
Yeah, well, exactly. It was early in the second half, I think probably the 42nd minute. Mark Bugden, who'd been bought over from Newtown by Warren Ryan, he was starting as hooker. He'd replaced Billy Johnston, who was originally the hooker, but he took advantage. He noticed that Ray Price was down in Black Pay. He'd earlier hurt his wrist trying to do a tackle on Steve Mortimer. So he was down, so the defensive line was down, and then he made a little, he looked up to his right and he did a little crab-like run. He was only about 15 metres out, and he scooted out of dummy half and got past pretty easily, actually. I think it was John Muggleton and then Paul Taylor, who was the fullback, but he'd come in the front line so there wasn't such a big gap, but it didn't help, and he scored pretty close to the post, and that was great for the Bulldogs, because they didn't really have a noted goal kicker. That was probably their only weakness in their armour in 84 after Ross Conlon got dropped. But Chris Mortimer fortunately converted it, and so it was the Dogs had finally hit the front. So that was it. It was only 2 tries in the game. So but at least 2 more than in 86, but we'll probably get to that later.
Yes, but as I said, a game of great defensive intensity, and in the end, one missed tackle proved to be the decider. I mean, Parramatta did have their chances. They had a very good chance late in the game there that Mick Cronin made a break. They actually looked certain to score, but Steve O'Brien came up with a very important intercept later in the match.
Yeah, well, Steve O'Brien, he was already very popular with the Bulldogs, or the female fans especially. He was a bit of a George Michael lookalike back in those days. But he definitely, and I think in the commentary, Ray Warren, who was calling it, and everyone knows Ray Warren, he's a para man, but he said that, Steve O'Brien, he anticipated, he came in field, he was on the left wing, and he came in field, he saw that Cronin had made a bust and found Lilliard on the inside. These were back in the days where the actual centres actually, linked up with each other. Yep. Unfortunately, now it's left or right. They hardly ever do. But, it looked like it was going to be a certain try. But Steve O'Brien, great anticipation. Because I was at the game, I remember watching it, and I thought, oh, no. And then he fortunately, Steve O'Brien came up with probably the play of the day, actually, to save the Bulldogs, because they just managed to hold on. Because it was a very nervous that last 10 minutes, because Parra were coming. And they, unfortunately, Mick Cronin missed another kick a goal sort of thing.
Yes, he did. Yep.
Which by his standards was probably not that hard, even though he was a toe poker. But so I thought that was pretty. I think that was like about 3 minutes from time, and then the Bulldogs were fortunate enough to just to hold on, and there was a little bit of biffo right on full time between John Muggleton and Langmack and Chris Mortimer, but nothing much in it, But the Bulldogs fortunately held on, and probably, without having my Bulldogs hat on, they probably deserved to win it that year. They were minor premiers by 4 points. Parrot had a great run, but it's hard to stay up all those years, sort of thing. They did have a great team, the Eels. But,
and you're right to point out Mick Cronin there, because that wasn't the only important shot at goal that he missed. He missed if you look back through his career, he did miss quite a number of important penalty shots for goal throughout his grand final career anyway. There were no penalties for Canterbury in the second half of this grand final. Peter Kelly, man of the match. Peter Kelly had a fantastic game on the day. He was named man of the match. The day after, Alan Clarkson said in the Sydney Morning Herald, he said, we saw not the building of a team, but the building of a club with financial stability, good management and a professional attitude. That's what took Canterbury to the 1984 premiership. So we come to 1985. Unlike the previous year when they started well, they didn't have a good start to 1985. They only had they only won 5 of their first 11 matches. Mark Bugden, who was, of course, the hero of 1984, he was suspended for 9 weeks after a tackle on Steve Rogers in the round 1 match against Cronulla. There was a lot of controversy for Canterbury throughout the season. They were investigated for their shoulder pads. There were conflicts between Steve Mortimer and Warren Ryan over the sort of playing style of the club. Conflicts between Ryan and Peter Moore, the secretary, and of course the ongoing feud with Kevin Roberts. So, Steve, it wasn't a very good start to the 1985 season.
No, as you said, Rob, they had a bit of a premiership hangover that first few months. There were 2 draws against Eastern St George in that first 12 rounds. So it wasn't as bad as it's seen, but still, Warren Ryan would have been happy with the start. He was a very intense and ruthless coach, and he had his heart set on inflicting pain on all the other teams and going back to back. So it didn't get off to a great start. Mark Bugden, he was the hero in the grand final the previous year, but he soon became the villain in round 1. He breaking Steve Rogers' jaw.
Yep.
And they lost him for 9 weeks, so that was a big hiccup, losing your hooker, the player who touches the ball the most. And then they had a lot of controversies. They sold a lot of papers that year. The Bulldogs, they were always on the back page. I always remember, because it was back then there was quite a few newspapers you could read. So it was always, you got the Telegraph, you got the Mirror, you got the Sun. Back then, I didn't really get the Herald back then, but yeah. So they were always on the back page, and I still have friends who still give it to me about those fiberglass shoulder pads. The Bulldogs got busted for when they were playing the Bears late in the season. They won the game 32-14 pretty comfortably, but a lot of people remember that game for the coach of the Bears at halftime, Brian Chicken Norton. He complained to the touch judges about Michael Hagan's shoulder pads, and subsequently at halftime, the referee Graham Annesley, he made sure that Hagan took those shoulder pads off, and they had to even delay the start of the second half because of it. And sort of after that, the Bulldogs were sort of, if they weren't already painted or portrayed as the villains, everyone, the Parramatta was sort of the media darlings, and the Bulldogs, everyone loved them when they were the entertainers, but now that they were the enforcers, and some of Warren Ryan's tactics were a bit questionable, that was one that caused a lot of controversy, even though, they, with that story, the Bulldogs had used those for quite some time, those shoulder pads, because Bill Noonan, a former player, a New Zealand national, brought him back from Canada when he went over there, and the ice hockey players used them. So there's a bit of a plastic bubble on the shoulders, but the Bulldogs players seem to like it, and that might explain why they produced so many big hits. And Gillespie got the nickname Cement, and a few of those other guys, because they definitely did some damage in defence, whether it was the shoulder pads or just they're great. Guys like Steve Folkes had great tackling techniques, and cut guys in half. But that was one of the controversies. And there was always in the back pages, there was always stories about Warren Ryan's feud with either Steve Mortimer or the Bullfrog.
Yep.
I think with Turvey, it was mainly because of their playing styles. Like Turvey he came through in the entertainer era, sort of thing, and he found Warren Ryan's style a bit probably boring, and he even admitted in his autobiography Top Dog that he would have liked a little bit more flair and freedom. But Warren Ryan, he was very probably being a school teacher, he sort of didn't like to take too many risks, and he had some called his style of play was a ball sort of thing. But I think that was the main reason why they had that feud, and he almost a few years later, we might get to that. He almost left the Bulldogs to go to Manly, and then when with the Wack and Bullfrog, I think that feud, the reasoning behind that one, well, they're both trying to be top dog. I think, who was the alpha male at the club.
Yep.
I think Warren Ryan resented the fact that he didn't get much of the glory for the Bulldogs' success. It was always sort of Steve Mortimer was getting the headlines and all that sort of stuff. But also with Bullfrog, I think he never forgave Warren Ryan for because a lot of people might not know Chris Anderson, who was the captain in 98-84 when Ryan took over.
Yep.
He was actually the son-in-law of Peter Moore. So they were, the Bulldogs were the family club in a number of ways. The Mortimers and the Hugheses, but also too a lot of the players were married to the wives of Peter Moore, the Bullfrog, and Chris Anderson was one of them. And then in late '84, he got injured and he wanted to come back and finish off the season because he'd been a great sport for the Bulldogs. But Chris Anderson came back and he was Warren Ryan put him in reserve grade, but then he got injured in reserve grade and then had to finish. That was the last game he played for the Bulldogs. So I don't think Bullfrog ever forgave Warren Ryan for how he treated a Bulldog sort of legend.
Yes.
And that sort of that was one of the reasons why I think that happened.
All right, well, so there are a number of, again, some important matches during this season. Are there any matches that stand out for you in the course of the 85 season,
Yeah, well, I think a little bit of a turning point for the Bulldogs was the round 13 game against West. I know West weren't, a great side in that era, but the Bulldogs still put 52 on them that day, and I think Farah scored 4 tries, But the three of the 4 previous games, the Bulldogs had been smashed by Parramatta, South, and Penrith. So they were sort of, lacking a bit of confidence. But I think, turning it on against the Magpies gave them a bit of confidence. But I think probably that the big one was round 21 when they took on the Eels at Belmore, and they gave them a bit of a rugby league lesson. It was 19-4. Lamb had another great game. Scored a try, set up 2, and that game, after that one, I think that game actually mentally scarred the Eels.
Yes.
So when they met them, and I'm sure you'll probably talk about in the prelim final, Para weren't the same team after that against the Bulldogs. They sort of lost that, or the Bulldogs weren't, they didn't fear them anymore, or they weren't scared of them, like maybe possibly in '83.
Warren Ryan,
That was a great win for the Bulldogs and really gave them a bit of confidence. And then they went on a run all the way to the only game they lost after that was I think it was when St George beat them in the semis.
Warren Ryan said after that match against Parramatta that you brought up, Warren Ryan said that this was our finest hour of this season. So he obviously knew that a corner had been turned after that victory over Parramatta. And I think another very important game for Canterbury during the course of this season was the semi-final against Balmain. Now, Balmain are a team on the rise at this point. 1985 it is, and a captain by Wayne Pearce. They actually finished second on the competition table behind St George in 1985. You know, the likes of Benny Elias and Steve Roach, Gary Jack are sort of like coming into the team now. They had an Englishman there called Gary Schofield, a very good player. So Balmain are on a team on the rise, but this turned out to be a very crucial game during the semi-final series for Canterbury.
Yeah, well, I was fortunate to be at this game, and it was, everyone has very fond memories, or especially of the ending. The Bulldogs were in trouble. The Tigers were, they did have a great pack as well to match the Bulldogs there, and they also had some great backs like Gary Jack as well too. And Schofield was a great player from England, an international. It was actually 8-8 at full time, so they had to play extra time. So it wasn't like these days sometimes they play golden point and all that. It was actually 10 minutes extra time, and the way that the game was going, it looked like we were going to have to come back again a few days later.
Yep.
But fortunately for the Bulldogs, and probably heartbreak for the Tigers, because who knows what could have happened for the Tigers if they got out of jail in that game that season. But Andrew Farah got the ball. He was playing on the wing that day. He'd been moved to wing. And he scored probably his most memorable and greatest individual try of his career. He raced about 65 metres down the touchline. Showed surprisingly good pace. He wasn't a noted speedster, but and he just beat Gary Jack to the try line in the corner. And that's where I was sitting. Was right in that corner where the Barongal stand is. So I remember it vividly, and it was a great try. And I think Bullfrog said after the game it was the most important try ever scored for Canterbury.
Yes, he did.
Because if they had to do the replay, I don't think the Bulldogs win the title that year. They would have been, because they were pretty busted, and they did lose actually from that game. Terry Lamb suffered a serious injury, and he didn't play any further part in the semi-final series. So that was a big blow for the Bulldogs. So and they probably paid for that game the week after, but at least they came good eventually.
Yes, you mentioned earlier there they went on to play St George in the major semi-final. They are beaten by St George 17-6. In fact, they hadn't beaten St George all season, but in the preliminary final, they absolutely crushed Parramatta. We pointed out earlier that round 22 victory did seem to scar Parramatta, and they crushed Parramatta in the preliminary final by 26-0. So Canterbury qualify for the 1985 grand final against St George. Quickly, I'll just mention the two teams. For St George, the fullback was Glenn Burgess. The wingers were Steve Morris and Dennis Kinchella. The centres were Michael O'Connor and Michael Beattie. Steve Linnane was the 5'8". Perry Haddock was the half. Lock was Graham O'Grady. Second row was Graham Wynn and Billy Noak. The front rowers were Pat Jarvis and the captain, of course, Craig Young. Hooker was Phil Ritchie. On the bench, they had Steve Fennell, Chris Guider, Chris Johns, and Alan Neal. And, of course, we must remember in 1985 that St George were going for a bit of history because they'd won the reserve grade and under-23 grand finals. So they were going for a clean sweep in 1985. Now, for Canterbury, the team was Mick Potter was at fullback. Peter Mortimer was on the wing with Matthew Callanan were on the wings. Andrew Farah did play in the centre with Chris Mortimer. Now, Michael Hagan was the 5'8". As you mentioned there, Terry Lamb had burst a blood vessel and he was out of the match. Steve Mortimer was captain and half. The pack was virtually the same as 1984. Locke Langmack, Folks Batiste in the second row, Kelly and Tunks the front rows, Billy Johnson was the hooker with Mark Bugden on the bench along with David Gillespie and Greg Mullane. Now, Steve, this was another very close, tense grand final. Just take us through what happened in the 1985 grand final.
Yeah, well, the Dragons probably looked the better of the teams early on. But I think, and guys like Graham Wynn were on fire early, and I think that might explain why he was on the end of a few left hooks
Yes.
in the game. I don't know if you remember, it was a bit of a Rocky versus Ivan Drago sort of moment. Steve Mortimer took offence to something Graham Wynn did. I think he stepped on his hand after he put up a bomb, and little Stevie Mortimer put a left hook on Graham Wynn and decked him, sort of thing. So it was a very fiery game, and I think Peter Kelly got Graham Wynn later in a scrum too. And amazingly, the Bulldogs had a bit of luck that one and got a crucial penalty.
Yes, this was a very crucial moment in the game because there was a scrum was packed and, it appeared as though Kelly had flattened Graham Wynn, but somehow, yes, the penalty was given to Canterbury, and that proved to be a very decisive moment.
Yeah, because not long after, the Bulldogs had a little bit more luck in the lead-up to their first and only try of the match. I'm pretty sure Michael Hagan, who was playing 5'8" that day for Terry Lamb, threw a forward pass to Langmack in the lead-up. But then a little bit not long after, the Bulldogs front rowers combined, Tunks and Kelly. And Kelly, who's probably more remembered for, his big hits and all that sort of stuff. He was also, quite a good crafty ball player, and he threw a great cutout pass to Peter Mortimer, and Parrot was his nickname, but Peter Mortimer, and then he raced around to score, and it was probably a little bit of...
Yes.
It was very sweet for Peter Mortimer after he got denied in 84, that in probably the same sort of position. He raced around to score, and I think that was around about the 28th, 29th minute, and the Bulldogs had hit the front, and Farah converted to put them up 6-0. And yeah, that was all she wrote. At half time, Michael O'Connor had a chance to narrow the gap, but unfortunately he missed that.
No, and he did.
Half-time.
Yes, he did miss an earlier penalty goal, a penalty shot at goal. Michael O'Connor missed an early shot at penalty very early in the game, not a difficult one. So he did miss some crucial shots at goal. But the second half of the game, Steve, was virtually played completely in St George's half. Yeah, well,
as a result of Warren Ryan and Steve Mortimer's tactics in this game, they actually had to change the rules because the Bulldogs' tactic was to, when they got close to the try line, Steve Mortimer would just put up a bomb, and in those days the rule was if the St George defused the bomb in their in goal, they didn't go straight to the 20 like they do these days. It was a dropout.
Yes.
So it was just like the Bulldogs just wanted to wear down because the Dragons at that year, they had some great attacking players, and they used up a lot of juice in defence. Their forwards started to tire, and it was a great, probably not, great to watch if you're not going for the Bulldogs. But it was a great tactic because, to be honest, probably in 85, the Dragons were bigger, better and faster than the Bulldogs. And as you mentioned earlier, the Bulldogs hadn't beaten them that year either. That Roy Masters, he'd had the wood on his protege, who actually Warren Ryan was coached under him at West years ago, so they had a bit of history there. But yeah, the Bulldogs did well to get out of that one. The only points they scored in that second half was pretty late. Like, they did have Callanan almost scored. He got a try disallowed because he was offside from a Farah bomb. But Farah did kick a field goal to put them up 7-0. And, I thought, I can relax. The game's all over. We're home again. But fortunately for the Dragons, they regained the kickoff. They did a short kickoff and got the ball back. And not long after, Steve Morris, whose sons actually, Brett and Josh, play for the Bulldogs in recent years. He did a sneaky little try. He grabbed it between Mick Potter's legs and regathered to score. And O'Connor, this time, he did manage to kick a tough conversion from the sideline to narrow the gap to 7-6. So I thought, don't tell me they're going to get us on the siren. But fortunately, Lanane, who had probably an unhappy game by his standards, he knocked the kickoff
Yes.
on, and then the Bulldogs managed to get the ball, and it was probably fitting that that Turvey died with the ball from the scrum win, and the Bulldogs got home 7-6 because Turvey was the difference, and he ended up getting, or Peter Kelly got, some people said Peter Kelly was the man of the match, but in recent times they've said that Steve Mortimer was awarded the Clive Churchill Medal.
It was
2008 when they did that centenary award sort of thing. So, but yeah, his game plan, he might have preferred to do a few more chip and chases and a bit more variety, but the game plan worked and it proved to be a masterstroke, and it's a sign of how great that Coach Warren Ryan was, that the New South Wales Rugby League had to change the rules because he just
it was a
outsmarted them.
Yeah, it was a massive tactical victory for Warren Ryan. He said after the game that Canterbury had, quote, cruel, ruthless control of the game. And Roy Masters, as you pointed out there, Warren Ryan was, of course, coached in the lower grades when Roy was at the first grade coach at West. Roy Masters was apparently quite distraught after the game. He said after the game, when we did get the ball, we were too weary from so much tackling to be able to make any impression. It was a fantastic tactical victory for Warren Ryan, and it was a game where I think really it was a grand final where the tactical kicking was absolutely decisive. The kicking game of Canterbury far out was much better than St George's. You mentioned Steve Linnane there. He had a very poor kicking game, and that proved to be the decisive factor and led to a rule change. But the grand final victory did highlight these internal divisions as well at the club, mate. There was, I think it highlighted the barriers between Peter Moore and Warren Ryan were highlighted during this match. He didn't congratulate Warren Ryan after the victory. In fact, it wasn't announced that he was going to be coach until later on that night, I think, at the coach for 1986 until later on that night at the Leagues Club. Steve, Peter Kelly, you mentioned there, had another great game in this grand final. What can you tell us about Peter Kelly? Tell us something about him. He's not one of the stars of the club.
Yeah, well, Peter Kelly, as you said earlier, had come over he started his first grade career at the Jets.
Yes.
He's originally from Eden, so down on the south coast. But he only actually played 68 games for the Bulldogs from 84 to 87. Then he ended up going to Penrith, but and he only scored 2 tries in those 68 games. But he got the man of the match in the 84 grand final, as you said.
Yep.
In some reports, and some coverage, he was the man of the match in 85 as well too. He was the cornerstone of the Bulldogs, the aggressive, the dogs of war. He was tough, he was rugged, uncompromising hitman. Warren Ryan loved him because he'd do what he said. But I remember Terry Lamb in an interview was saying that actually Peter Kelly was actually quite intelligent for a front rower.
Right.
So he was a pretty good ball player. He did have a few injuries. That's why he started wearing the headgear.
Yeah.
Even though he thought he was a bit old school, he said, it makes me soft. But he did have a few injuries, so that's why, for self-preservation, he started wearing the headgear and shoulder pads and finally a mouth guard. But most people probably remember the one thing a lot of people remember Peter Kelly for is actually Anzac Day 86 against South Sydney. We might get to that when we're talking about 86, but...
yes.
When he got, I think it's the quickest send-off in history, when he flattened Ross Harrington straight from the kickoff.
Yes,
and he actually beat the bugler who'd been doing the last post. He beat him off the ground, so that's what a lot of people remember Peter Kelly for, but it's probably a bit unfair to just target him for that, because he was... and probably... Surprisingly, he didn't make many of the rep teams during that era, even though he was such a dominant tight head prop. He's probably one of the best players never to play for Australia, actually. Like, he did play a few games for New South Wales later in his career when he went to Penrith, but really for a guy that sort of dominated, he was a big game player. Without Peter Kelly, I don't think the Bulldogs win either of those grand finals on that day.
All right. Let's get to 1986. Canterbury, they signed Paul Dunn from Eastern Suburbs and Tony Curry from Brisbane. But the season again starts badly for them in 1986. Steve, just quickly summarise what happens throughout the 1986 season.
Yeah, well, it was ominous signs early. Round one, they got done by the Tigers, 18-12. And then round two had a big bearing on their first half of the season. It was against controversy always seemed to be when the Bulldogs played the Sharks.
Yeah.
This was at Belmore. The Bulldogs, smashed them 38-2, and Turvey scored 2 tries to Steve O'Brien. He scored a double as well too. But most people probably remember that game for Steve Mortimer doing a high tackle on his opposite number, the Cronulla Sharks halfback Mark Wakefield. As a consequence, although nothing happened at the time, no one picked up. He did end up having to go to the judiciary, and he got 9 weeks for that, and that sort of, and then as a result of that, Terry Lamb had to play a lot of halfback, and then Hagen was 5'8". But that was a big blow for the Bulldogs losing their skipper for so long. And as I mentioned, also in '86, one of the games I recall, because I was at the game, was the Anzac Day one, and we've already mentioned about what happened to Peter Kelly. But the thing about that game also too was the Bulldogs played the whole game with 12 men against a South team who ended up finishing the season second. And the Bulldogs still, it was symbolic of how great a team they were, that they still beat the Rabbitohs 26-2.
Yes.
The Rabbitohs didn't even score a try, and they had an extra man. So that was probably one of the Bulldogs' actually finest hours during the Dogs of War, I feel.
There were a lot of injuries as well during that 86 season. Mick Potter broke his leg, so that was a big loss. And I think Stephen Folkes and Peter Mortimer, I mean, important players spent a lot of time on the out through injury throughout the course of the season.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Potter was, he was a great fullback. He was Les Johns-like during his time at the Bulldogs, but he never seemed to be the same player after he broke his leg that year with the Bulldogs. He ended up, rediscovering his form and went to the Dragons later on. But he only played 13 games in '86. Peter Mortimer, another great outside back for the Bulldogs and probably try scorer. He only played 40. He missed out playing in the grand final that year. As you mentioned, Folkes as well too. He had a great season, Folkes, that year. Actually, played a lot of rep football. He played for Australia and New South Wales, but that took its toll on him, and he had a few injuries like a groin tear and a fractured cheekbone. And even in the grand final, he couldn't finish the grand final. He came off early in the second half of that grand final. And the other major injury, I feel, sort of was another reason why the Bulldogs couldn't get the three-peat that year. They lost David Gillespie, Gillespie. He had a tragic injury not close to during the semis, where he lost his finger. He was a garbo, and he lost the first joint of his index finger in a garbage accident with the garbage truck. So, and he played 18 games that season, and he was on his way up. He was like the new breed of the Dogs of War. He'd come through those last few years, so he was like one of the enforcers in the pack sort of thing. So that was as big a blow, I'd probably say, as any of those players that suffered the injuries during that season. And that year too, they did suffer a few sort of disappointing losses that were uncharacteristic for the Bulldogs. Like, and you sort of just got the feeling it wasn't going to be their year. Like the Tigers, they smashed them 28-0 at Para Stadium. And also too, there was a famous Monday night game. It's called the Battle of Belmore, where they played South. And that was a fiery affair. That was that was like back in the old days in the 70s. There was a lot of biffo that day, and South's got them. So usually in those sort of wars of attrition, it was the Bulldogs. But you sort of got the sense that maybe all those years were starting to catch up with them, and playing that tough, aggressive. It takes a lot out of you, especially the forward pack, and a few of them are getting a little bit older. And so that you just got the feeling that, and especially with those few key players out, that they just weren't the same the same team as the previous years.
Well, they lost. Canterbury ended up finishing third in 1986, third on the table. They are behind Parramatta and South Sydney. They lost the major semi-final to Parramatta. They were quite easily beaten, 28-6 in the major semi-final. The preliminary final, they again come up against Balmain. As you mentioned there earlier, Balmain had beaten Canterbury twice during the course of the season, but Canterbury got the better of them in the preliminary final. They win quite convincingly. So Canterbury qualify for the 1986 Grand Final against Parramatta. And I sort of think back, I remember even myself personally thinking back to these matches between Canterbury and Parramatta during this period. They sort of reminded me of, it was like Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. There were these monumental clashes that they were involved in during this period. You know, two great competitors coming up, two highly skilled competitors coming up against each other. And here they meet for the, well, let's say the thriller in Manila, the third and final match. It's the 1986 Grand Final. I'll just quickly mention the two teams again. For Parramatta, fullback was Paul Taylor. The wingers were Mick Delroy and Eric Groth. Cronin and Ella in the centres. Kenny and Sterling halves. Ray Price was the captain and lock forward. John Muggleton and Mark Laurie were in the second row. Terry Leabeater and Jeff Bugden were the props. Michael Mosley was the hooker. On the bench they had Peter Wynn and Tony Chalmers. And of course the coach, Jack Gibson, had left. John Money's the coach of Parramatta now. For Canterbury, Phil Sigsworth was the fullback. Farah and Steve O'Brien were on the wings. Michael Hagan and Chris Mortimer were the centres. Terry Lamb, 5'8". Steve Mortimer, half and captain. Langmack lock. Steve Folkes and Paul Dunn were the second rowers. Kelly and Tunks in the front row. Mark Bugden is back as hooker. And on the bench they had David Boyd and Jeff Robertson were on the bench. Now again, Steve, the scoreline does betray the match. If you look at the scoreline, you'd think that not much happened here. But again, in actual fact, there was plenty of things happened in this grand final. Mick Cronin missed some early shots at goal. Fairly easy shots at goal as well. Brett Kenny appeared to score a try fairly early in the match. Do you remember that incident?
Yeah, well, Brett Kenny had a habit of scoring throughout his career in grand finals. All the ones that Eels won, he scored twice. So he looked like he was unlucky not to get another double in this game. That try where Peter Sterling put a grubber through and it bounced up high and Kenny leapt spectacularly over Phil Sigsworth. But just on the way down, unfortunately, he just lost grip of the ball. That would have been a sensational try for Parramatta, but unfortunately it wasn't to be. But it was the doggies dodged a bullet there. But yeah, that game, that first half, the Eels probably should, even though the Bulldogs were running with the wind in the first half, the Eels should have been a lot further in front. Mick Stone was, the Bulldogs were getting hammered in the penalty count. I think it was 8-3 from memory at half time. Sure, the Bulldogs brought a lot of it on themselves, especially Paul Langmack had a few brain explosions that day. I think he gave away 4 penalties in the first half. But yeah, so they finally got rid of Kevin Roberts as they thought it might get a little bit easier for him. But Mick Stone, I think, was even harsher on the Bulldogs that day. And even Kelly found himself in the sin bin, so the Bulldogs were down to 12 men before half time. He put a hit on Ray Price.
Yes.
And yeah, Mick Cronin finally kicked the goal just before half time, and so it was only 2-0 at half time. It was a bit like a game of soccer. Yeah, so
it was 2-0 at half time. In the 52nd minute, Terry Lamb kicks a penalty. There was a late tackle on Steve Mortimer, and Terry Lamb equalises, makes it 2-2. That was in the 52nd minute. Then in the 62nd minute, the young replacement there, David Boyd, he is penalised for a high tackle again on Ray Price. And Mick Cronin kicks this penalty to make it 4 points to 2. But in those final 20 minutes, I can remember Canterbury went very close on a number of occasions in that last 20 minutes. They threw everything at Parramatta at the end of that grand final.
Yeah, they definitely had them under siege, and I feel, no, probably the listeners are going to think I'm biased, but if Phil Sigsworth doesn't get sent off in the 67th minute for that for the coat hanger on Brett Kenny, very unlucky Phil Sigsworth. It wasn't in his nature. He wasn't like a dirty player.
No.
It was just a reflex thing, you know, and you hardly ever see players sent off in a grand final, but I don't know, Mick Stone must have had the angry pills that day or something, I'm not too sure, but yeah, that was a big hurdle to overcome for the Bulldogs. They're playing with 12 men. They were coming home with a wet sail, and there were a few times where they looked certain to score, but credit to Parramatta, some great defence. I think there was one time Barra was going to look like he was going to score in the corner, and there was like 6 defenders. You know, in the same corner where he famously scored against the Tigers the previous year to get him through an extra time. He got short, and then Terry Lamb had a chance to lock things up and send the game into extra time. But unfortunately, you could his right knee was strapped, so in his defence, he probably was playing injured. And but unfortunately, he couldn't kick. It would have been his 77th goal of the season, probably his most important one, but he just couldn't get it that day. And right on the hooter, the Bulldogs had a chance. They were right on Parramatta line, and Ogden in the last play, maybe he got flashbacks to '84 when he was the hero, but he probably would like his time over again with that play where he tried to scoot over from dummy half, but this time Ray Price wasn't down injured, and they were waiting, and they knew, and they caught him because the Bulldogs and Steve Mortimer, said he had Jeff Robinson, the wild man. He had him open down the. They probably would have scored the next play if he could have got the ball from Steve Mortimer because they were so close. He offload to Jeff Robinson, and he was the fresh man on the field. Maybe the Bulldogs, they go on, they win that game, and then they get the three-peat, and then people talk about the Bulldogs as the best team of the decade, whereas there's all this debate about who was was it Para or was it the Bulldogs who was the best team of the 80s.
After the match,
unfortunately, it just was maybe the Bulldogs had used up a little bit of their luck in '85 against the Dragons, and I think the Eels got the fairy tale ending that day because it was Ray Price and Mick Cronin's last game, so you can't begrudge those Warriors. They've had distinguished careers at club and international level. So, it was a tough loss, especially considering we played quite a bit of the game, a man down like Peter Kelly in the first half, and then Sigsworth. And Bugden did get sent off, sin-binned, Jeff Bugden that is, for Para late in the game for I think a professional foul on Steve Mortimer, taking him out. So they did finish 12 on 12, but I still think that Phil Sigsworth send off. If he doesn't get sent off, I think that the Bulldogs come home over the top of the Eels, but that's rugby league, unfortunately.
And of course, it was the first ever trialless grand final in history. Now, Warren Ryan said after the game that we had Peter Kelly in the sin bin for 10 minutes, Phil Sigsworth sent off, and with such a heavy penalty count against us, it was asking a bit too much. We finished trailing 13-8 in the penalties, including 9-3 in the first half. And despite this, the famed Parramatta attack could not get through. That was his comment after the game. And you mentioned earlier Steve Folkes. You mentioned earlier what a great season he had. Tell us a bit about Steve Folkes, because he'd been playing for Canterbury for a long time by this stage.
Yeah, well, him and Steve Mortimer, I think Chris Mortimer, or Peter Mortimer was in that year. They were the only guys left from the entertainers era.
Yep.
in the late 70s, early 80s. So he probably didn't get all the headlines of some of the other guys in the forward pack, but considering he was only 85 kilos and playing, it's a lot bigger man. He was a very valued member of the Bulldogs team. He was like a bulldog. He was ruthless, resilient, tough,
yes.
pretty intense. And 86 was a very good year for Steve Folkes. He finally made it on the reps. Well, he played for New South Wales before, but he played for New South Wales. He got the clean sweep. Then he played against. He made his international debut against New Zealand, scored a try, and for him that was his greatest sporting moment, or at the time it was. But pound for pound, and George Paponis, who was a former Bulldogs captain,
yes,
he said he was the best forward Canterbury's produced. So that's a pretty big rap when you go through the list of, especially in that era, all the great forwards in the Bulldogs pack and Bullfrog, who actually was his father-in-law too.
Yes.
Because Steve Folkes married another one of Peter Moore's daughters, and he said he was the rock on which great clubs are made. So it was probably quite fitting when he did pass away back in 2018. They named the High Performance Centre after him at Belmore, and his service was actually at Belmore. It was a very moving service, and I remember Lynn Anderson, who was Chris Anderson's wife, who's now in charge of the Bulldogs. She said about Steve Folkes that he wasn't a very religious man, but this is where he wanted to be. Wanted to be buried at Belmore because this was the church of the Bulldogs.
Yes,
so, and of course he made the Bulldogs had the greatest team ever, and Folkes probably not only for his career, like he played 245 first grade games and he scored the most tries by any forward out of the Bulldogs, but also too then he had a longer distinguished career with the Bulldogs as a coach. And culminating in the 2004 grand final where they beat the Roosters.
Yes.
He was. A lot of people always say it's between Steve Mortimer and Terry Lamb about who was the greatest Bulldog and who was top dog, but Steve Folkes gave great service to the Bulldogs. He come a long way from being a Bankstown Sports Junior and Punch Bowl Boys school captain. So he had a great career and, unfortunately gone too soon.
Yes, I mean, even in death, he left an impact because he's passed away, of course, fairly early, but his passing has sort of ignited some, a lot of research and debate, and the authorities in the game, the management of the game now is looking much more closely into these brain injuries and concussion injuries. So he has sort of like his impact continued even after he passed away. 1987, Steve. Just sum up the season for us. 1987. What was happening with Canterbury in 1987? Yeah,
it wasn't probably by Bulldog standards. It wasn't a great season because the Bulldogs, they pride themselves on being there in September.
Yep.
And unfortunately, they just missed out. They finished sixth.
Yes.
But it wasn't like and they finished on like 30 points. They just missed out by 1 point of sneaking into fifth spot. And who knows if they got in there with all their experience.
Yep.
And quality players, they might have made another run. But it was a little bit disappointing. Whether it had a lot to do with the Kangaroo Tour hangover.
Yeah.
The previous year in '86, the Bulldogs had a lot of players on that Kangaroo Tour. And a lot of our listeners, who are a bit younger, probably don't realise how long away they were and how many games they played. When they're, Terry Lamb, that he played on every game of that tour, 20 games. Like it'll never happen again, surely. And that's got to take its toll on and especially having to be up for so long. They were always there in September. They never got an early mark. They started the season quite well actually. They beat the Bears in round one. 28-8, and I remember I was at a game in round 4 where they beat West 26-16, and Terry Lamb scored all the points, and the ground announcer joked. He said Terry Lamb 26, Western Suburbs 16.
Yes.
So I remember that game. That was probably one of the highlights of '87 because there weren't too many. Yeah. But really, if you go through the season, the only team that made the top 5 that year that they didn't beat was the Roosters.
Right.
But every other team they had beaten. So even the Premiers, Manly, they'd beaten them once, and Canberra, who was also the grand finalist. So it's not like they had fallen that far behind. But I think all that, their style of play was becoming a little bit outdated, maybe, and the way they played had taken its toll on some of those players. And during the season, they had they were struggling to score points. That was their big problem, I think. They were out of ideas in attack. The only guy who was sort of troubling the scorers was Terry Lamb.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he got leading try scorer that year. Midway through the season, they lost 3 games in a row. And in those 3 games, when they lost to Illawarra, St. George and North, they only scored 6 points in those 3 games. So
Yes.
It was sort of, they turned in from the dogs of war to the dogs of war.
Okay. And I mean, at the end of the season, I think it was quite poignant at the end of the season because Peter Mortimer leaves Canterbury. He goes off to play for Hull Kingston Rovers in England. Chris Mortimer also leaves. He goes to play for Penrith. So these have sort of been stalwarts of the club, and they're going. And the Mortimer brothers as a package. What can you say about the Mortimer brothers' contribution to this club, Steve?
Oh, well, the Mortimer brothers, especially Steve, their contribution to the Bulldogs was immense. When the Bulldogs were called the family club, and most people identify with the Mortimers. They remember those iconic images of the Bulldogs play, like the Mortimers after the grand finals with all their kids walking around doing the lap of honour. Like, no one used to do that before the Bulldogs did, and before the Mortimers did that, made that sort of a tradition. But yeah, sort of, it was a very sad day, that last game. I remember I was out there at the SCG. They were playing against the Dragons, and they had to win to sneak into the semis. But unfortunately, they gave the Dragons too much of a head start, and they came home late. Turvey and Lamb both scored tries, but they just fell short, and they lost 16-14. And it was sad. It was like the end of an era, end of the Mortimer dynasty. They played together since '78. So, but yeah, sort of Turvey gets most of the raps, and probably rightly so. With his career, he played 272 games, scored 79 tries. He was the captain of those back-to-back titles, and he also was captain of the first captain to ever bring the State of Origin title back home to New South Wales. But Chris Mortimer and Peter Mortimer both were integral members of that team. Chris Mortimer was a great, tough, hard-running centre, great defender. And when he left to go to Penrith, it was very disappointing, but it was it just felt like the end of an era. Sure,
things were coming to an end.
He was still there for one last year, and the Bulldogs came back and won in '88. But without him and also Peter retiring, Peter doesn't get the raps I think he deserved. Peter was a great player as well too. He scored the same amount of tries as Turvey, but in like 82 less games. He only played 190 games, or not only, but 190 games. He scored 79 tries too. He's like the 6th most tries in first grade for the Bulldogs. But he was a dashing centre and winger. Always seemed to score a try in grand finals.
Yes.
But these days, he's probably, like his last few years, sure, he had a few injuries, but yeah, these days, most people probably remember him as being the father of Daniel Mortimer. And that's sort of, it would have been great to see Daniel Mortimer play for the Bulldogs and continue that tradition of the Mortimer name with the Bulldogs, but maybe it was too much pressure on him. I'm not too sure. That's why he went to Parramatta. But he got a grand final. He won a grand final with the Roosters in 2013. But the Mortimer, when you think of the Bulldogs, or especially people from my vintage and era, the Mortimers are synonymous with the Bulldogs. They were what, as much as during maybe those Dogs of War, the Bulldogs were painted more as the villains than they were when they were the heroes, and everybody loved them as the entertainers. I think if you ask most fans, they probably whether they loved them or not, but they respected the Mortimers because they were, the good country boys, the good morals. They were never making, headlines for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
They were great role models and ambassadors for the Bulldogs. And when Chris Mortimer left and Peter Mortimer retired, it's sort of a little bit of, they were the heart and soul of the Bulldogs for a long time. Them and the Hughes brothers.
Yes.
But, sort of a little bit of the Bulldogs' spirit died when they left.
And of course, Warren Ryan is replaced at the end of the 1987 season by Phil Gould. Steve, I just wanted to finally just ask you, what was it about this Canterbury team that left such an impression with the supporters?
Well, Rob, everybody loves a winner, and the Dogs of War were the most successful team in the Bulldogs' history, the only time they've ever gone back-to-back, so that plays its part. Also, too, I think the players as well, you can't deny, especially some of the greats that have played for the Bulldogs, were during that era. Arguably, Terry Lamb and Steve Mortimer are probably the two finest Bulldogs players in history. Everybody loves them, and that they're still involved with a club or were involved with a club, so people still have fond memories of them. Also, too, a thing that doesn't get much press, but I think the fact that so many of those Bulldogs players from that era went on to coach and coach successfully at the NRL level. Guys like Phil Gould, he coached them, only the year later in 88 to win the title. He was there in the 80s when Warren Ryan was coaching. You had Chris Anderson. Sure, he left in 84, but, he helped the Doggies win in 95. And then also Steve Folkes. He was the coach when the Bulldogs won their last title back in 2004. So, and there's also, a lot of other players who played. Michael Hagan, he won a premiership for Newcastle as well. I could go on. Mick Potter, Terry Lamb, they all coached NRL level. But so they stayed in the game. So that's why the players have, the fans have fond memories of those players. And also too, I think that the main reason why the Bulldogs fans remember so fondly that era, because that's when the Bulldogs actually played like Bulldogs, and that culture from that era continues to this day. Like the Bulldogs pride themselves on their defence. They never give up. They never throw in the towel. They're like Bulldogs, and that's the Bulldogs fans have a lot of respect for the players who played like that. That's why in recent years they love players like Josh Reynolds, James Graham, because they continue the history of that culture from the Dogs of War. So they always hold a fond place in the fans' hearts. But it's pretty much it came down to it was the players, the success, and the fact that they actually played like Bulldogs.
That's the way it was. The Dogs of War, Canterbury, 1984 to 1987. My name's Rob Corra. On behalf of Steve Greige, this program was produced by Tony Peterson. Until next time, may the Force be with you.
We are the mighty Bulldogs, the Canterbury-Bankstown. We play it hard, we play it tough, we're the greatest in the league. We've got a mighty pack of forwards and a line of leading back. When that whistle blows, you all will know as we leave there.